morning. This morning we're going to continue looking at the book of Exodus, and we're going to hear a story that many of us will remember from our childhoods, I'm sure. It's the story of the infant Moses who was given away by his parents so that he might have life. So without further ado, let's listen to the words of Exodus chapter 2, beginning to read at verse 1. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it, and placed it amongst the reeds on the riverbank. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Whilst her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket in the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse this child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said yes, so the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We know that the overall theme of the book of Exodus is one of redemption. It's a recounting of how God delivered the Israelites and made them his special people. But we start with God's people, the Hebrew people, in a state of captivity. And Pharaoh feeling threatened because of the strength of the group. They weren't cowed and intimidated by the captivity, but rather they were growing stronger and stronger. In an act of immense inhumanity, Pharaoh had instructed the midwives should murder every boy child at birth. However, going back into chapter 1, we read that the midwives, because they loved God and at great risk to themselves, ignored Pharaoh's instructions. They said that the Hebrew women gave birth before they got there. Thus the boy babies lived. So in chapter 2, we find God preparing the way for the freedom of a nation, for the freedom of a people. And the way? Well, it was the unlikely person of a baby. And doesn't that echo with the coming of Jesus, who came not to save a nation, but to save the world in his life and in his death and then his resurrection? And Jesus, just like Moses, was born into a hostile situation, was born in the midst of rulers who weren't of his own kind, in the midst of someone wanting his death because he felt threatened by him. Moses, we know, was a child born into oppression, into a seemingly hopeless situation where a tyrant had decreed the death of every boy child. But with God's guiding hand, this was no ordinary child. Indeed, we know that Moses went on to become the leader of his people. He became an agent of their freedom in the future. Though, as we read on through Exodus, it will become very obvious that the path to freedom, the role of leadership, weren't always smooth. They didn't always go as the people wanted. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. In this section of Exodus chapter 2, it speaks clearly of the bravery of a mother, of a selfless love that was prepared to give her child away in order that he might continue to live. First, at her own risk, she hid the child. She kept him safe. And then when he became too big to hide any longer, she trusted him to God. She wrapped him in a blanket, in a basket, and put him in the reeds. She didn't know what would happen. She didn't know who would take him, if anyone. But she gave him up because she wanted him to have life. It was a costly act, wasn't it? As a mom, I can't begin to imagine doing that. And yet, as a mom, I know that I would want nothing more for my children than life and the best possible life that they can have. So I'm sure we can understand the actions of Moses' mother. What this reminds us of is a family unit that live not just for themselves, but for each other. A family unit that want the best for each member of it. A family unit that pattern for us the very best way of being a family. It reminds you and I that as recipients of the undeserved love of God, we too have the responsibility to live in love for each other, not just for the family, not just for the people we like, but for the strangers, for the outcasts, for the threatened, even when that might become costly in our own lives. And we live in a period that is so troubled, where there is such great inequality, where we know that even in our own town, there are people going to bed hungry and cold because they lack the resources to feed themselves and warm themselves. There are mums even today who don't know how they're going to keep their children safe in the midst of troubled times, in wars in other lands, in domestic violence situations in our own land, in situations of great need where they don't know how they're going to feed their children, and so they go without themselves. You know, particularly as parents, this story is a timely reminder that maybe we have to set our children free to live the lives that they were born to. And that too can be costly. We might want to keep our children close. We might think that they owe us something because of all we've done for them as they've grown up. But you know, they don't. They're their own people, and they're God's chosen people. They were made fearfully and wonderfully in the image of God. And who knows what God has predestined for them? Who knows what they'll grow up to be if we just set them free? Maybe they'll go on to change other people's lives, to save lives, to make immense scientific discoveries. Maybe they'll be very special to one particular person or group of people. We can't presume to know what's the best for our children as adults. We merely have to find the courage of the mother of Moses and set them free to fly, having given them the best childhood we can, having given them the best opportunities that we can, even when it's costly to us. A particular phrase in this passage leapt out at me. It's the response of Pharaoh's daughter. She found this child, and she must have known that taking him in would incur the wrath of her father. She must have known how her father felt about the Hebrew people and the threat that he saw within them. And yet, when she opened that basket, what she saw was a child, an individual, not a race, not a threat, but a baby in need. And she responded in kindness. She responded in generosity. She responded from her heart, perhaps, rather than her brain, knowing that potentially it could cost her too. She saw the humanity of the child, not the issue of his identity, not his race, his creed, his religion. One person reaching out in compassion to another more vulnerable. In generosity, in humanity. And wouldn't our world, our nation, our neighbourhood be a better place, a safer place, if we all responded in the way that Pharaoh's daughter did? If we looked more to the needs of others than our own pleasure or comfort or desire? If we considered our actions in the light of God's plan for his world? You know, as adults, it's easy to let the familiarity of Scripture blind us to the messages that they might carry for today. I hope as we think on this very familiar story, we might all find something new to ponder on. We might see this tale of love and compassion and self-sacrifice and wonder what it says to us, what it is that God has in store for us and for those that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And maybe it will just remind us that God has a plan for our lives, a plan to keep us safe, a plan, as it says in Scripture, to prosper us and not to harm us, to give us a hope and a future. I think I've come to the end of what I want to say today, so may I wish you all a very peaceful, a very blessed day, where you know that God is with you, whatever life might bring.